There is a most dramatic story in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Now, everybody knows King David, the king of Israel, but many people really don't know his story. There's more on David than any other person in the Bible besides Jesus. The story is very dramatic. It's got all the elements. It's got dignity, heroic commitment, power of God, scandal, murder. I mean, everything imaginable is in the story. And it's inspired by the Holy Spirit. It's the most dramatic story. It's interesting, inspiring. In one sentence, it's must read. It's a must read story, the life of David. So part of my goal tonight is to convince you that from this night forward, you are going to make it a point to read the whole life of David through a couple times a year. It's in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I've got it. They got the passages there. It's 1st and 2nd Samuel, and you'll read it through like in a weekend. You can read it through in a weekend or a couple nights. And I want to challenge you to know this dramatic story. Paragraph A, 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. The Lord, this is what the prophet Samuel, now there's one of the key players in the drama is Samuel the prophet, the old prophet. He's 80s or 90s, we don't know. He's got long hair, he's been a Nazirite from his youth, piercing eyes, and he has a walk with God like nobody in the earth in his day. And when Samuel came to town, the whole town trembled because he walked with such authority with God. Well, Samuel comes to the first king of Israel. His name is Saul. And he tells him in 1 Samuel 13, we're not going to look at the whole thing. 1 Samuel 13, verse 14, he says this. And you can read the whole verse later. He says, God's rejected you, King Saul, and God's chosen another king in your place. And here's the phrase, he has sought for himself a man after his own heart. Now, the thing that makes this passage remarkable is that this is God describing a person. I mean, it's one thing for me to call you a man after God's own heart or a woman after God's own heart. It's another thing for God to call you a woman after God's own heart. It's the only person in the Bible that God said, this person is a person after my heart. Now, many people in the Bible have been a person after God's heart, but God said this one, and God especially sought for this man, and this man's about 15 years old. I mean, you're kind of a little thrown off. He sought for him a man. Well, he's 14, 15 years old. In God's point of view, he said, he's a man. I take him seriously. He loves me like nobody else. And he lives in a little out-of-the-way town. Think of the most remote town you can imagine. Bethlehem was that. We're talking 500 people, far side of West Texas. You know, an hour from the closest Walmart, that's Bethlehem. No, I mean it. Seriously. This guy is so off the radar, he doesn't have a chance to get picked by anybody for anything, but God finds him. Now, in paragraph A, I give three different dimensions of being a person after God's own heart. I don't want to go into that right now. I wrote a book on this, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You can get it and read it if it is interesting to you. But to be a person after God's own heart, number one, you're committed to obey the commands of God's heart, but that's not enough. Number two, David was committed to study the emotions of God's heart. See, it's one thing to commit to obey, but if you study the emotions of God, then you're empowered to obey. And number three, David was a person after God's own heart because he contended or he fought for the purpose of God in his generation. It wasn't enough that he touched God. He wanted his generation to be changed and to fulfill God's purpose. It says in Acts 13, David served the purpose of God in his own generation. Now, did you know, and you do, there is a specific purpose for your generation. And here's the idea. Find out what God is doing in your generation and throw yourself into it 100%, no matter what it costs you to be involved in it. Find out what God's doing in your generation and throw yourself into it with no reserve. Don't hold back anything. Paragraph B, 2 Chronicles 16. Now this is the secret, or this is the behind the scenes of what's happening. The eyes of the Lord, 2 Chronicles 16:9. The eyes of the Lord are searching all over the nations. The eyes of the Lord are searching for men and women, young and old, who has a loyal heart for God. And God can find them in the remotest village in the deserts of Arizona, or like I said, West Texas, an hour from the closest Walmart. I'm telling you, the most remote place. The eyes of the Lord can find you if you have a heart that's determined to be loyal to Him. My prayer tonight is that some of you will make a new determination to be loyal to God regardless if anybody sees it. That you would say, I'm going to be a woman after God's own heart like David. I'm going to be a woman but with the spirit of David, or I'm going to be a young man or an old man. God's eyes are searching right now. They're looking through this auditorium. They're looking in the most remote places of the earth because God is passionate about people that would be loyal to Him. Paragraph C, Isaiah 55, verse 4. God told the prophet Isaiah, He told the prophet Isaiah, I've made David a witness. Now this is why we want to study the life of David. Not just because it's a dramatic story, it is. It's a very interesting story. And again, there's more on David than any other person in the Bible. But it says here in Isaiah 55, verse 4, that God, let's go ahead and put that verse back up there. I want you to read this. God said, I have given him to be a witness. I've made David the model of what I'm after. David is the picture. You study the life of David because you want to know what God's after. Paragraph D, Jeremiah 3:15. Now this is a promise for the generation the Lord returns. God says this, I will give shepherds after my own heart, or according to my heart. In other words, God is going to raise up in the end times. This passage is about the generation the Lord returns. He's raising up shepherds like David according to God's own heart. We're believing God for 1 million, 10 million, 100 million. We don't know the number. But God is right now looking for shepherds after His own heart. I want to be one. You want to be one. Paragraph F. Now I give you this is just marked paragraph F. This is where you can find the life of David. Again, I want to challenge you, maybe once a month. I'm talking about a big weekend. It might take you 6, 7, 8, 10 hours. But you're going to say, this weekend is my life of David weekend. Maybe you get 2 or 3 people, you take turns, you read the whole life of David. Now, I did a bit of traveling. I'm 54 now, but in my 30s. About that time, and I had this deal when I go overseas, like a 10-hour flight overseas or whatever, 12. I always read the whole life of David going, and I read the whole life of David coming. I just automatic pilot. Whenever I took a long flight, and I took a bunch of them in those years, I would start 1 Samuel 16, reading the life of David. 10 or 12 hours later, the stewardess would be going, man, what are you reading? I go, the most dramatic story you can imagine. But hang on, stewardess, because I still got 4 chapters to go, and we're ready to land, and I'm really in a real juicy part, so I'll talk to you after we land. But here's the point I'm saying to you. Get a vision that you're going to read the whole thing a bunch of times. 3, 4 times in a year, maybe once a month for a while. Know the life of David. That's my point.